Welcome to the Going Zero Sustainability Podcast. Each week, Christy Cook, Seth Combs, and Eric Pasewalk help business leaders navigate the sustainability maze in the workplace. Going Zero is sponsored by Emerald Ecovations, creating sustainable solutions for everyday essentials at your place of work. From coffee cups and paper towels to food service containers and more. Emerald Ecovations is leading the charge in tree-free, plastic-free, compostable solution. Visit emeraldecovations.com.
All right, welcome back to another edition of Going Zero. We're really excited to start another conversation today. I'm Eric Pasewalk. I'm joined by my partner in crime, Christy Cook, and we're very lucky to again have Dr. Cheryl Baldwin join us to discuss a new topic on sustainability. We are here to learn more about connecting climate and nature strategies for business. Cheryl Baldwin is a PhD and Vice President of Sustainability Consulting for Pure Strategies, where she partners with corporate clients to develop and execute sustainability strategies to improve performance across retail, food and agriculture, home and personal care, as well as cosmetics industries. She also leads the firm's global market research to generate new insights to accelerate business transformation to a more sustainable future. Cheryl authored Pure Strategies market research reports, such as the recently released Planet Forward Playbook, among many other reports. She also wrote 3 books, including The 10 Principles of Food Industry Sustainability, and she holds U.S. and international patents. She holds a Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and PhD degrees. So Cheryl, welcome to Going Zero. We're really excited to have you back. Opening question, as always, although you already answered this one time before, but maybe it's changed and shifted since you joined us previously, but we'd like to know, what is your definition of sustainability?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back. So has the definition of sustainability changed much since I last was here? Not much. I see sustainability as a field of work, really kind of aiming towards a future where we're getting net zero, nature positive, circular, and a just future. You know, there's tools that people talk about in sustainability, things like the triple bottom line, where we balance environment, society, and economy. Maybe we have clear aims and short-term targets, some of which we'll talk about today, but those are all, I feel like, part of the field of sustainability where we're working.
Great, thank you for that. That's fantastic. I think it did shift just a little bit, maybe. Yeah. Another question we always like to ask, and it's because it gives us context into who you are and the work that you do, is how did you get started? How did you get focused on this work that you do?
So I got involved early in my career in sustainability, even before there was a field of sustainability. I was working on indigenous and local food systems and using kind of the natural circularity of microbial fermentations. And that led me to a really unique opportunity to have a fellowship with NASA, so the space agency, where I supported work on developing a circular or zero waste food system for people living on Mars. And I'd mentioned last time that this is what was pictured in the film Mars that starred Matt Damon, but my work was 15 years before the movie came out, but I've stayed engaged in sustainability ever since then.
I love that. And is that where some of your patents are, by the way? Can you even talk about that, Cheryl? But that's got to be interesting.
No, all the patent work came from some of my early career after I finished my PhD. I worked at Kraft Foods for a while, working on kind of the longer term research opportunities for advancing food products and food innovation. And I worked on really kind of nutrition and wellness products. And so a lot of the patents are connected to those opportunities.
Nice. That's been one of the things I've been curious about since we chatted last was, tell me more about these patents. So
before we get into the questions, Chrissy, I gotta at least hear your thoughts on, Mars. Like, are we going there? Is it the future? Is it not the future? Do you have any idea?
I do not. I have not stayed up to date. I, used to kind of stay plugged in what's going on, following the latest books, some really interesting ones out there. Still have on my bookshelf from years ago, but keep track of some of the different launches that go out for, sampling for water and microbial activity on the planet. However, not terribly up to date, so I can't say for certain, other than that there's certainly a lot of work to be prepared for that. And some of that research helps with the preparation of if there is going to be, human exploration of Mars and maybe potential life, the humans living there, but also it helps drive new technologies and solutions into, the marketplace that we have on Earth. And I laugh because my kids are really into freeze-dried like candies. All their friends, are talking about this, like the trendy thing. And of course, that all stemmed from, the need to have dehydrated food for different space missions many decades ago. So it all comes back.
It all comes back. It circles back. It's a circular system. Yeah. Freeze-dried candy. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't really need to know more about that. Well, I think maybe thank you for indulging my curiosity because I just couldn't let that rest. But good to know that freeze-dried candies and foods are regaining traction with the youth.
Yes, I'm going to add it to the trends and the important things to note for this podcast. Thank you, Cheryl's kids. Eric, your kids aren't eating this candy yet?
Oh, it hasn't made it out to my children yet, unless I didn't realize it. But yeah, that's fascinating. Maybe next year we'll make it out to the West Coast. I don't know.
Yeah, that's funny.
Well, Cheryl, you know, microbial things, freeze-dried candy, Mars. Tell us, how did that go to Pure Strategies? What's the work you're doing at Pure Strategies now, and how did you get there? What are you excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned my career has been a long journey. I, worked on sustainability in my graduate work and before then, and then worked, at a food company, brought sustainability into that work, and then worked for a nonprofit organization. And so where I'm at now at Pure Strategies really brings together all those experiences. So I'm working with organizations to drive progress on sustainability. So much of that is building sustainability strategies and programs. And then we dive deeply on product and supply chain issues like nature and climate, packaging, chemistry, and agriculture. These days, we're doing a lot of work on climate risk, connected to things like TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, nature impacts for TNFD, so Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, a lot of interest on sustainable packaging because the extended producer responsibility regulations coming out, and of course, broader, progress on sustainability. To give you just maybe a few examples of the types of projects, how this pulls together. I have been supporting Walmart for many, many years on their product sustainability work. So we've been engaging the supply chain, driving innovation on sustainable packaging. So Walmart's recycling playbook, for example, is a publicly available resource that we support, as well as supporting some of the work they're doing on their Scope 3 or Project Gigaton. We also, connected to retailers, work with the National Retail Federation, NRF, and building guidance on how retailers can advance on net zero climate strategies. And kind of more to some of the topic we'll dive in today. I've been supporting Toyota Motor North America on building their nature strategy and biodiversity strategy. So what are their nature impacts on their value chain? Where are those opportunities? What types of targets make sense? And how do they progress? And then I also co-lead our Nature Action Forum for Business. So this is something Pure Strategies runs. We've been running for several years now. And this is where a cohort of companies come together and get a chance to kind of interact with their peers and experts to help advance their work on nature strategies.
I really like the idea of the cohort approach because it gives you the opportunity to learn from other organizations what they're doing, ask those questions, and really, honestly, sometimes you get to ask based on experience others have had in implementing or driving this change. And so I found that very helpful. So that's gotta be, I would think, fun, but also incredibly fruitful work. I don't know why the word fruitful is coming to me today, but yes, it's gotta be beneficial for participants. I could see that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's been, I think, a great experience for both us, and it's a bit of what was a starting point for some of the playbook and resources that we'll talk about later. But the companies that are participating, I think, really do like that opportunity to interact with their peers, because they feel a little bit, it's a little bit validating, when they're hearing others going through similar problems, but then they also are inspired by how their peers are working through some of those similar challenges, and kind of, it gives them just more examples and ideas to draw from to think about, how they can advance their work. And as we're moving into our third year in 2025, and we're expanding the program because it has been so strongly received. So we had started off with an intro cohort where we would just take a couple months out of the year and progress the group through a bit of the basics around nature strategy, and then advance them to developing an action plan on where they would go next. And now that we have a few of those cohorts and we've heard a lot of interest, we're going to continue that for companies that are looking for that starting point. But we're also offering a year-long membership so that we can continue this interaction with peers and experts, so that companies can just move at the pace and level where they're at, and just continue to have that support over time.
Yeah, that sounds valuable. I can just reiterate again, I had an opportunity to participate in a similar type program, and it was invaluable. So yeah, I'm excited to hear it's progressing and growing, because I can see what a resource that is. Congrats on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheryl, can you share what inspired Pure Strategies to create the Planet Forward playbook, and how it may differ from other sustainability guides?
Yeah, it connects a little bit to what we were talking about with the Nature Action Forum, but also our client work, where the work that I was involved in with climate and nature, I just kept hearing about challenges companies were facing on things like Scope 3, and how the added complexity of accounting standards changing, and the expense of measuring and verifying, especially land-based projects, we were hearing that was slowing progress down on climate. And then, we're talking to companies around nature, and they were just saying, hold on, it's just too much. Like, we've got a lot to handle, and it's already too hard. But the challenge is we don't have a choice. Like, planet and humanity need us to progress on these issues. So I took a step back after, hearing that message repeatedly, and wanted to think about how can we make this easier. And that's what the Planet Forward series of reports stemmed from, was really this idea of, we need progress. It's clear that things are challenging. So how do we make this all easier to begin and then progress from? So I'll just maybe summarize briefly the concept around Planet Forward. There's two reports. There's a Planet Forward Strategies that we launched in February 24, and then we just recently launched Planet Forward Playbook in September. And the two pieces really drive home this idea around climate and nature being interconnected. We can't progress on one without progressing on the other. So simultaneous work needs to be advancing in order to see meaningful progress, especially on global aims. And companies have been working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, kind of thinking about their fair share of the Paris Agreement to get to net zero, but we have not seen them doing the same for nature. So there's a need to fill that gap and work towards the targets that are defined in the Global Biodiversity Framework that includes targets beyond just like there's a target 15 that everyone talks about for business that's really looking to assess and disclose management. But there's important targets that companies need to be stepping up and taking their fair share on, including protection, restoration, and sustainable management of natural resources. And we found, I'd heard about the challenges companies saying, oh, it's too much, I don't know where to start. But we found an easy way to get started was to just start to think about this as, kind of a gap assessment concept of, well, what are you already doing? Some of this climate work, connects to this nature work. So you might already be doing things in sustainable management, restoration, and protection. So start to think about that as a launching point to move forward from.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of me deciding not to continue to pursue my wildlife and fisheries biology degree in college. It's like, oh, the second semester of chemistry just destroyed me. And you got all these company leaders who be like, wait, I've got to start learning about biology and ecosystems and all this stuff. I mean, why? I don't like this. I pursued a business degree.
Yeah, we are hearing companies say that nature is so much more complicated than climate, which is so funny because when you think about it, nature is so much easier for people to connect to. They see it, they experience it, they vacation for it. Like it is something important to most people's lives in some form or capacity because they see that, respect, either a species, some kind of animal or a tree or there's something that people have a close connection to. And so utilizing nature being much more tangible to people should be easier than climate. And so that's part of the reason why we're saying let's find a path ahead, because this is really a meaningful place for people and companies to work towards.
So help me understand that. So we've got so many frameworks. I'm a company. I'm trying to figure out what to do. Climate's important. Been hearing about decarbonization. Focus on that. And now I've got to focus on nature. I like the idea of the gap assessment. See where you're at. See where there might be some interaction or some overlap. But why? I think why, from a strictly business standpoint, besides humanity and having a planet and people on it, why do businesses need to be thinking about this nature-based approach if they haven't already?
Well, maybe to say it simply, businesses rely on functioning ecosystems. So it's essential to their resilience and long-term viability. And what I mean by ecosystems are, climate is an ecosystem, water, land. You can imagine how every company connects to these things. So there's definitely a business case to be made by moving forward in an effective way. And climate, we know is already warmed over a degree since pre-industrial levels, and the Paris Agreement, our global aim, is to stay well below 2 degrees. So, it's becoming harder and harder. But to add to this, nature is a carbon solution. It represents 30%, at least 30% of the emissions mitigation that's needed to meet the Paris Agreement. And healthy ecosystems are essential to support climate adaptation needs, like absorbing heavy rainfalls or withstanding droughts or other climate impacts that we're already experiencing. But nature is already at its own crisis point. Nearly 70% of monitored species populations have decreased in the last 50 years. We're seeing species extinction rates accelerating really rapidly. So we really have to address both of these challenges at the same time. And so we talked about the Paris Agreement that has the aim for cutting emissions by half by 2030 to get to net zero. By 2050, the Global Biodiversity Framework has its own set of aims for 2032, which I'd mentioned, the protection, restoration, and sustainable management, but they put numbers to it. So they are looking for protecting 30% of nature by 2030, restoring 30% of degraded areas by 2030, and then sustainable management of natural resources. And companies are connecting to all of those elements. So we see that if a company is just focusing purely on mitigation, so reducing their emissions and not thinking about nature, because of this interconnectedness, it's really an incomplete strategy. You need to have both to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I agree with you too. And are you seeing that businesses are making these connections, that whether it's the risk to physical space for where they are, or people that might be impacted, or are they making that connection? Are you still having to help them see some of that connection a bit too?
I think we're still at a place where they're not yet understanding how climate and nature are connected. Because there's just been so much focus on climate. That's part of why we're saying like the two are connected, instead of saying, oh, just go do nature and do climate. We see how the two things are needed at the same time and support each other for success. It's starting to unlock some conversations. So when some of the companies we've talked to, either as clients or that are part of the Nature Action Forum, that they say if they start talking about this connection, it's helping advance that level of interest for adding nature, doing more nature work. Instead of saying, oh, well, now we got to do nature because nature is important. If they start the conversation with saying, well, nature and climate are the same thing, and we need to balance out the work that we're doing, that has definitely been helping. And we're hearing that as a way to start to get things to move forward.
Christy mentioned sort of the gap assessment process a little bit earlier, and so just be interested to hear if you could elaborate a little bit on how the assessment helps companies identify new opportunities for climate and nature resilience.
Yeah, we find that companies benefit from thinking about what they're doing at a higher level. And so this gap assessment concept really just takes it up a level and aligns with the targets in the global biodiversity framework to provide a science basis for the way they're thinking, but then a clear structure to start to see where things are at. So what we put in the playbook is like a simple resource. It's in a worksheet, and it's just 3 columns. Basically, there's a column for protection, a column for restoration, and a column for sustainable management. And a company just can start simply by listing out what they're doing now and putting it in the appropriate column. So if they're doing a deforestation-free program, that would be sustainable management. If they're doing some work on habitat restoration on site, or maybe with some value chain partners, that would go in restoration. Or maybe they're philanthropy programs funding some nature protection, so that would go in the protection column. So if you start to bring together all the different things that a company is engaged in, you can start to fill it out. And just the simple listing activity helps a company start to visualize where they've been investing pretty heavily. And almost every time we've done this with dozens of companies, they're pretty heavy in one of the columns and not very well balanced in thinking about where they could go strategically. So just that exercise alone is quite helpful for a company to think about where they're at and where they can go. But then we add another level for a company to benchmark to see if their effort is enough. And the benchmark is a metric. And, so if a company is ready to start to think about a metric, again, we're keeping it at a high level, and it's aligned with the global biodiversity framework. So the metric is what we're calling a nature footprint. And for most companies, it's going to be more like a land footprint, which is how much land they're using in their value chain, like how much land is in their operations, how much land is used to produce the raw materials that they're using. So that land footprint concept is a metric to say, well, how much land or nature are we relying on for our business? And then you can use the global biodiversity framework's targets to think about, is it enough? Are we doing enough? So if they remember that metric, the target for restoration was 30%. So is 30% of the nature footprint, or an equivalent of 30% of their nature footprint, being restored? So the same thing would be for protection. The target the global biodiversity framework has is 30% of land should be protected. So how much of the company's land footprint are they supporting an equivalent amount of? Is it close to 30%, a lot more or a lot less? So those benchmarks help to gauge, are we really far off or pretty close? And we just continue down that path. So kind of the listing activity as well as this benchmarking activity is what the gap assessment includes. And these are pretty easy things to get started with, especially compared to, the concept around like greenhouse gas accounting. This is a quick way a company can get started.
By measuring land, I think is that partially it's because it's quick, it's measurable, it's obviously connected to nature, but why land became sort of a focal point?
Well, so the nature footprint is the concept, but when we've been working with companies, the majority of companies don't have all that much of like a marine footprint or kind of a freshwater footprint. So the bulk of their nature impact tends to be on land use. And so, just again, a way to keep things as easy as possible, the concept around their nature footprint being more about land use is a really good way to start. If they have an idea of how, they're kind of where, freshwater and marine environment impact is, then that can come too. But things like how much land is used for raw material production, it's readily available. You don't need to go get your suppliers' data. You can use, global databases on yield and things like that. So there's a way to quickly estimate it, and so that enables things to move forward.
I think even having that knowledge of saying, this is knowledge available in a database. Some folks probably don't even realize that. That in itself is so helpful, and I can relate to those examples of sharing some of that information. That's great. So thinking about companies' point of view, like you mentioned, they have a lot of competing priorities, a lot of different frameworks and such, and you're simplifying this process, as I'm understanding it. If I put words in your mouth, you please correct me for all of our listeners. So some of the practices they're doing might fall into that nature category, although they're not thinking about it right now. What are one or two examples of that? That maybe you see that are most common, that you could share with us for us, please?
Yeah, definitely. One concept that helps with nature and maybe is worth explaining a little bit because it is different than climate is that some of the work with nature can be happening outside of a company's value chain. And the reason is that nature protection and restoration is more valuable if it's happening in areas where there's, kind of higher value for biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So just, protecting and restoring nature, on a particular farm or field or something may not be as valuable as doing that, in an area where there's much more rich species and important ecosystems. So this opens up the opportunity quite a bit more. So I'll talk about some examples that kind of use that idea a bit. But I do want to highlight that there's a lot more examples in the Planet Forward playbook. So definitely take a look at the different examples there. But for example, Walmart is one that's highlighted where they are supporting nature protection in the amount of area that's equivalent to the land that they develop. And they utilize partnerships to support that type of work. And so there's a project with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or a series of projects that they're working with that organization to really drive progress. And that work is outside of the value chain. And they're investing in areas where there's particular importance of biodiversity and also bringing local economies and indigenous peoples into those projects too. So that's one example. Another is Toyota. Toyota, both Walmart and Toyota are clients. Toyota, we're working with them. They have a target to help with habitat restoration, and their work includes on-site. So they are working on habitat restoration on their operation locations, but they're also investing in habitat restoration to support pollinators and key areas where that habitat is most important. So that investment and support kind of covers a couple of different places. And I'd say that one thing, maybe just to add to this, that helps companies think about how to structure progress, because when we have these conversations around, projects like I just discussed, companies still think about carbon accounting. And the idea is, let's think beyond that. And one way to think beyond that is to use this land metric we talked about, or nature footprint, and have your aims really under that umbrella. So have a target around how much area of land or water are we going to be supporting protection, restoration, and sustainable management. These are real targets that companies have. So Walmart's got this target, Toyota's got a target, General Mills, there are many that have these types of targets. And by doing this like land and area focused target, really helps to allow for progress in those areas that we're talking about, protection, restoration, sustainable management, without using carbon accounting and removals accounting as things that prohibit their ability to progress. So because you can easily look at how much area is this project involved in, and that's a way to start to move forward. And then it also allows the opportunity to frame up metrics that are locally meaningful. Because maybe there's a specific habitat or specific species or something, or there's a water basin target. So it just keeps this opportunity to move forward at a high level while other things develop over time.
Yeah, you just mentioned how Walmart incorporated some ideas from indigenous peoples. You mentioned local communities. You got started in this work by focusing on indigenous food systems. So I'd like to hear how involvement of local communities and indigenous peoples in these projects ensure a more inclusive and equitable outcome.
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert on the topic, but I think, we're all aware that local communities are the ones that are most close to the regions and environments that we're talking about. So just their vicinity and that their culture and livelihoods are much more connected to these ecosystems means that they are super critical stakeholders in these types of projects. There's some studies that look at how indigenous peoples and local communities are managing a substantial amount of land, even though from a population numbers perspective, they're a small minority. They are managing or are nearby so much of the areas that we're talking about. And their success rate in effectively managing biodiversity and ecosystems is better than many other ways of looking at it. So, not only are they a critical factor, but they are going to be a very helpful set of stakeholders to bring along on this journey. And so I'd mentioned the example earlier, and this is how most companies are bringing indigenous peoples and local communities into their work, is by working with local organizations and utilizing those partnerships to bring those stakeholders and their participation into the work.
Well, we've just, at the time we're recording this right now, it's the week of election results. It's election week, essentially. And one of the things I like to talk about is, trends and predictions. But, there's been a lot of trends and predictions, talking, going back and forth now that we've had this major event happen here in our country. And what are you hearing? I won't hold you to trends and predictions, but maybe what are you hearing right now from clients that might have reached out, or just peers? What are you hearing, and what advice do you have for those that are maybe more cautious than you think they should be? Businesses that are more cautious than they should be as they're thinking about sustainability in the future.
Yeah, it's definitely a time with lots of conversation. It's, starting to unpack and understand what is kind of confusing and what will probably feel like conflicting marketplace around sustainability. And I say that because the concept, that people are all talking about is that the new administration in the US is going to be rolling back a lot of the support around sustainability, in particular around climate. But we do have state and also global regulations that are continuing. So there's going to be a need for companies to still progress in the places where they are today around climate, nature, circularity. I mentioned a few of the frameworks earlier. And so while, there's going to be this kind of weird dichotomy, but we still have the state and global regulations driving for progress despite what's going to be happening at the federal level. So I think maybe some advice would be just to keep the bigger picture in mind. It's a little bit of the theme around what I talked about with the Planet Forward playbook, which was let's step back and think about where we're really needing to go globally. The Paris Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework, you've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals and others that just paint that bigger picture. And there's a reason to keep that bigger picture in mind because companies will have better resilience. They have more innovation and growth opportunities as we think about that, broader business case.
Yeah, I would just say I 100% agree and glad that you're reiterating that message. This isn't the time to stop, it's moving along. It is global. So let's make sure we're keeping up with it and driving. So great. I'm glad to hear that's what you're hearing too.
Yeah, on that note of not stopping, we always like to leave our listeners with actions that they can take, particularly business leaders. And so what advice or action would you like to share and advocate for that businesses should consider?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I like to share, especially when I'm talking about this idea around Planet Forward. And one is don't let perfect be the enemy of good, because we need to be moving forward. That's the challenge we were facing. I had kind of described how we were hearing companies feeling a bit challenged by the lack of clarity around carbon accounting for Scope 3 and the different challenges around monitoring and verification. And I'm saying, but we still need to be moving forward. So let's not stop and instead progress over time. So from a Planet Forward perspective, this is where that high level land footprint aim and thinking about how your company can establish that type of target and utilize that as a way to drive progress instead of waiting for the perfect carbon accounting solution to be out there. So that's one around don't let perfect be the enemy of good. The other is a bit of an analogy that I use around building an effective game plan. And this kind of refers to how climate mitigation and much of climate strategy has been a defensive approach where companies are really just thinking about reduce. When we need a more complete game plan that has an offensive approach too, and that's where nature resilience fits in. And we need, like any game plan, the two pieces to come together to really have an effective approach.
I really like that, Cheryl. I think nature isn't perfect either. So nature doesn't allow perfect to be the enemy of good either. And also just, I think previous conversations have shown that, don't be afraid to fail. Failure isn't necessarily moving backwards. It's a step forward as well. So I think all of that's really important. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for this conversation. To the listeners for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation, don't forget to subscribe, share this episode with your network, and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and reach more listeners. Before we sign off, Christy, Cheryl, is there anything else you want to bring up, talk about? Mars, failures, anything?
I want to talk about Mars more. I think that's a whole nother situation, but I do. I'm a geek. I love it. I just want to throw out very quick a couple of things. If you're a business, download the Planet Forward playbook. Do the gap analysis. See where you're at. look at and check out this Nature Action Forum. See if it makes sense for you. And I wrote up a little bit of a note here, but I like this being an offensive approach versus defensive because nature is a carbon solution. So those are just a couple of notes I wanted to end with too. So those are my last thoughts, Eric. Cheryl, do you want last word today?
I think that is all great. So thank you for sharing that. And yes, we are here to help companies progress. We've got lots of free resources available, as you've mentioned, to download, opportunities to engage with peers through the Nature Action Forum, really low cost opportunity there that helps companies move quite a lot forward. And then our team dives deeply with companies that are needing kind of that extra help. So here to help and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Going Zero. Keep up with the latest in sustainability by subscribing to our newsletter at goingzero.org or on LinkedIn. To learn more about going tree-free and plastic-free in your workspace, visit our sponsor at emeraldecovations.com.